In this study, we're going to learn about Lot's wife. In this regard, there are two types of people in the church. There is Lot, who represents the true believers, and there's Lot's wife, who represents the unsaved in the church, who do not love Christ, nor are they prepared to give their lives for him. Okay, so before we get to Lot's wife, we need to go back to the Old Testament to understand what happened before Sodom was destroyed. In Genesis chapter 19, verse 4, we read about a group of people who surrounded Lot's house because they wanted to have sexual relations with the two angels. And we know that these two angels or messengers actually represent God. So let's turn to Genesis chapter 19, beginning in verse 4. But before they lay down, that is, the people inside of Lot's house, the men of the city, even the men of Sodom, compassed the house round, both old and young, all the people from every quarter. And they called unto Lot, and said unto him, Where are the men which came in to thee this night? Bring them out unto us, that we may know them. Now, as in the days of Noah, we also see in Luke chapter 17 that God compares the days of Lot to the return of Christ. In Luke chapter 17, verse 28, we read, Likewise, also, as it was in the days of Lot, they did eat, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they builded. But the same day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. Even thus shall it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. And so, we learned in Genesis chapter 19 that the days of Noah was a time of adultery. It was a time of fornication, and it was rampant in the sense that it infected both old and young. So we too live in a time when man's eyes are filled with adultery. And according to Romans chapter 1, we're living in a time when men are going to leave the natural use of the woman, and similarly, women are going to leave the natural use of the man. And as a result, God says he gave them up. He gave them over to a reprobate mind. And we know that the genesis of this sexual immorality is in part due to the turning away from truth to lies. So Romans chapter 1 is essentially giving us insight into the mindset of the people of Sodom. The Sodomites actually represent the people in the church. And the church has become a place of spiritual fornication because the congregations are trying to get right with God on their own terms. In other words, they have turned from truth to works gospels, which teach we can do something to save ourselves. So even though sexual immorality is a sin, God is informing us that he is more concerned about the spiritual adultery in the church. Sodom represents a place of spiritual fornication. And when we go to 2 Peter chapter 2, we find that Lot was vexed by the filthy conversation of the wicked. And when we examine the context of 2 Peter chapter 2, we find that he was vexed by false teachers who were bringing damnable heresies. So let's turn to 2 Peter chapter 2. Beginning in verse 1, we read, But there were false prophets also among the people, even as there shall be false teachers among you, who privately or privily shall bring in damnable heresies, even denying the Lord that bought them, and bring upon themselves swift destruction. And that reminds us of what happened to Sodom. In fact, in verse 6, we read, "And turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them with an overthrow, making them an example unto those that after should live ungodly." That's referring to our time. "And delivered just Lot, vexed with the filthy conversation or conduct of the wicked." And so here we see that Sodom represents a place of spiritual fornication. It is a place where damnable heresies are being taught. And righteous men like Lot, who was also like Noah in the sense that he was a preacher of righteousness, they are vexed by this filthy conversation. And we know that the word filthy is related to the fact that if we try to become saved by our own filthy works, God looks upon those works as filthy rags. Okay, so that brings us to our main point, and that concerns Lot's wife. When we go back to Luke chapter 17, God completes the historical parable of Sodom by informing us or warning us to remember Lot's wife. Let's turn to Luke chapter 17, verse 32. "Remember Lot's wife. Whosoever shall seek to save his life shall lose it, and whosoever shall lose his life shall preserve it." Now, in order to understand the meaning of losing our life or preserving our life in relation to Lot's wife, God provides us with 3 companion verses using the similar language of verse 33 of Luke 17. For instance, in Matthew chapter 10, verse 38 through 39, we read, "And he that taketh not his cross and followeth me is not worthy of me. And he that findeth his life shall lose it, and he that loseth his life for my sake shall find it." And so we see here that God is expressly saying that to lose one's life is to take up his cross. Now, when we go to Revelation chapter 11, we find a spiritual example. In verse 7, God informs us that the 2 witnesses were killed after they finished their testimony, and then the beast was loosed out of the bottomless pit, that is Satan, to rule over the church. And when they were killed, their dead bodies were left in Sodom, where the Lord was crucified. In other words, the 2 witnesses simply represent those who will be cast out of the church, who will bear their cross for Christ and the gospel's sake. And so what we have learned about Lot's wife is that she was not prepared to lose her life. Sure, she left Sodom, which represents the church, but she didn't do it because she wanted to be faithful to the gospel. She did it because her family was leaving. She did it because her husband and her daughters were leaving. And so it was more of a emotional fellowship instead of one that was spiritual. Okay, so with that in mind, let's go back to Genesis 19 to discover how Lot's wife was destroyed. In Genesis 19, beginning in verse 16, we read, "And while he lingered," that is Lot, "the men laid hold upon his hand, and upon the hand of his wife, and upon the hand of his 2 daughters, the Lord being merciful unto him." So what we see here is that God is giving us an illustration of how he saves. He's informing us that Lot lingered to indicate that none of us, of our own will, want to become saved in accordance with God's rules. And so God himself had to drag Lot and his family. As John 6 says, we had to be dragged or drawn to Christ in order to be saved. Now, once we become saved, God gives us a test. And in this case, the test was to not look back. Let's continue in Genesis chapter 19, in verse 17. And it came to pass, when they had brought them forth abroad, that he said, Escape for thy life. Look not behind thee, neither stay thou in all the plain. Escape to the mountain, lest thou be consumed. So as I mentioned earlier, God provides this test. In other words, he's telling us that to turn away from the filthy conduct that Lot witnessed when he was in Sodom. In other words, turn away from the works gospels in Sodom, the church. Yes, I know you have family in the church. I know that the fruit of the fields of Sodom were plentiful when Lot got there. But now God is warning you that he's going to destroy Sodom to such a degree that it will never bear fruit again. That is, salvation, the fruit of salvation, is no longer available in Sodom, the church. Okay, so now we can understand that even in the Old Testament, God is showing us that he saved Lot's family by his own power, by his own will, when he brought them out of Sodom, the church. So now we keep this in mind when we go back to the New Testament in Luke 17, where God tells us to remember Lot's wife. We can look back a few verses early and see the same concept about obeying God's command to depart out of the church. Going to verse 31 of Luke 17, we read, In that day, he which shall be upon the housetops, and his stuff in the house, let him not come down to take it away, and he that is in the field, let him likewise not return back. Remember Lot's wife. So in order to understand more about why Lot's wife looked back, we got to study this phrase, returned back. And we find this same phrase in Matthew chapter 24, where God is not only speaking about remaining on the housetops, but he tells us why we go to the housetops. And the reason is because the abomination of desolation has been set up in the holy place. So let's turn to Matthew chapter 24. There we read, in verse 18, we find that phrase, return back. There we read, Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. This is very similar to what we read in Luke 17, where God says, don't go back to get your stuff. I'm going to provide you with everything you need. Your main concern right now is just to obey me, because I'm about to bring judgment. And that judgment is expressed in Matthew chapter 24 as the abomination of desolation. God has set that up in the holy place. And according to Daniel, the abomination of desolation is associated with two time references. That is the 1,290 days, which we learned earlier points to the year 1994. And then in Daniel chapter 8, God tells us how long this desolation is going to last. It's 2,300 days, going from the year 1994 to the year 2000, at which time the believers began to come out of the church. And they were not supposed to be looking back, longing for the false prophets and the false teachings of the church. They were to be like Lot, who was vexed by the filthy conversation of the wicked. He could not stomach the preachings and doctrines about accepting Jesus, being baptized in water, or making confession of faith as evidence that one is saved. No, he understood that he was brought out of Sodom completely by the will and the power of God. God took his hand, even though he lingered. and God brought him out by his mercy. But sadly today, many are like Lot's wife. They are not prepared to give their life for Christ or the gospel's sake. They are not prepared to leave their families and their friends in the church, because that is where they get their fellowship. They don't realize that our fellowship is with the Lord and his Son, Jesus Christ. And so if we have to leave the church, we are willing to lay down our lives. And as we see the church going deeper and deeper into apostasy, God tells us, remembers Lot's wife. Oh, sure, the world is becoming more sinful, men with men, women with women. But that's not the big concern. The big concern is our spiritual condition. Because if we are not saved before Judgment Day, we will suffer the eternal fire that God poured out on Sodom.